Hello and welcome to the second of these insightful conversations about place. These videos are free to access and are aimed at A-level geography students studying the Changing Spaces Making Places unit, although they are available for anyone interested in hearing more about the built environment and listening to different perspectives on how we design, understand and experience the places we spend time. They are part of a project called Your Place Curriculum, funded by the Ove Arup Foundation and developed by Placed in partnership with Our Place. Today, I welcome Sarah Jones-Morris, award-winning director of Landsmith Associates. Sarah is a landscape architect and urbanist. She was selected as the Design Council's leading woman in design and has over 20 years' experience across a diverse range of UK projects. And no doubt will get us thinking in this conversation today. Hello, Sarah, welcome.
Hello, thank you for inviting me for this.
I mentioned there your current role. I wonder, could you tell us a little bit about the route into what you do now? You know, how did you end up where you are?
Okay, yeah, no, definitely. I think first of all, I should explain what a landscape architect and landscape architecture is, because it's funny, in the UK it's not that well known, but in other countries it's a very well known profession, like in the States. My main part of my job is about designing outdoor environments, but the actual profession itself is much wider than that. It involves sometimes management, science, engineering. It's very broad. Because if you think about it, our outdoor environment is very, very diverse. It could be seascapes, the sea, or it can be towns, cities, townscape, or landscapes, but also more rural. So very diverse context, particularly in the UK, where for such a kind of small country, it is very varied. So that's my, just to define what it is. But to actually get into the profession itself, so it's a combination for me of arts, design, geography, science, and a bit of mathematics. It's quite varied in that sense. But yeah, so my interest was because I was thinking about doing architecture, and it's actually very different. You know, you talk about a building in a set form. Well, what I was really interested in is what was living things, i.e. plants, which is quite unusual for a profession. So most professions, you're dealing with things that are not living. So and because they're living, you can't really control how they're going to grow in X many years. So I have a project, for example, it's a nature reserve called Avron Marshes, and just in 3 years it's completely transformed, but like it's completely changed how the original planting was going to go in. But that's totally normal, and we know that that's possible, only if it's very managed that happens. But it just gives you an idea about sort of the changeability of things. So it's not a static thing, landscape at all. It's changing all the time.
Yeah. Wow. And so when it comes to design, you make sure you consider that through your design. I guess there's only a limited amount that you can actually control.
And, you know, for example, pathways or the way streets are designed. I do quite a bit of street design too. And you can, that's a bit more predictable because they're fixed forms. But obviously communities and use and change, like for example, if you're a student and you go out on your street now, your street may look very different in 10 years time. And that's just because of the way people use streets and spaces also evolves, not as quickly dramatically as plants can be, but they can be, definitely. And you can see that in quite a lot of city centres where you get different demographics, different populations moving, that it does affect what happens in the outdoor environment.
So what was it that made you want to go into being a landscape architect?
If I'm going to be completely honest, so my mum used to like maintain gardens and garden design, so I had an idea that way, but it wasn't something that I really wanted to do, and I really didn't like working with what are called domestic clients, i.e. private clients.
Yeah.
I just found it a bit singular. And I found it much more interesting what was sort of beyond, in terms of more sort of public public streets, public spaces, parks, rather than small private gardens, because it's actually a limited enjoyment to that single family or person, while public parks are much more to do the enjoyment of all.
Yeah.
So it was that sort of led me to it, but I just like the diversity of the challenge.
Yeah.
Because you're kind of, it's not just problem solving, it's you're sort of co-creating or creating something. And so it's that sort of process, which I think is a little bit more interesting, much more varied and much more challenging.
Wow, thank you. And so did you enjoy the whole aspect of your studying and your training to get to where you are?
Most of it, except for my hate writing. I absolutely hate writing, but actually it's beneficial now because now I have clients who are really pleased that I have very succinct, short reports. Basically, I hate writing. So like, so, you know, sometimes that can be a plus rather than a minus, because I've had a lot of feedback where there have been very long reports sometimes. So you have to sort of try and make sure that you communicate the salient points and the most important things, but not leave everything else. You need the detail, you need the evidence, to be honest. And that's really critical. But yeah, that's the bit I was really not that keen on. But some people love it. Some people love it.
Just going back to, you know, you've mentioned a little bit about the things that are involved in your work, but what's a typical day then? So you may do little bits of writing, but how would you describe a typical working day for you?
Okay, so as much as I love my job, unfortunately, it is a battle in the UK to get a good quality landscapes and landscape projects. It's very much sort of, it's not so much now, it seems to be increasing, I think, since COVID, but also now that climate change and biodiversity crisis are up the agenda, it's a bit more emphasized. But things like nature and health, etc., were just very much a secondary or even tertiary issue. So that means that your job a lot of the time is convincing. It's to be able to pull evidence together and to be able to demonstrate convincingly what you're doing is the right thing. And that's not just written, that's also visual. And that's your challenge, is you need to cover quite a lot of different ways of communicating what you're trying to propose, or the issues that might be on site or together, because that's a really critical point.
So visually communicating, would that be your own sketches or would that be photographs?
Sometimes photographs, sketches. It depends on the client as well. So some clients can understand plans, but majority of not just clients, communities, etc., really struggle to understand two-dimensional information. So you have to produce quite a bit of imagery, three-dimensional and photographs, for people to really understand. So yeah, there's that's quite a critical, important point. But to be honest, it shouldn't be a limitation as being in the profession, because there are people who do that exact thing as illustrations, as their main career thing. So, and also you need the verbal side as well. You know, the way you talk, the way you write, the way you draw. You need all of those skills in different levels depending on the project.
And you mentioned there a few kind of challenges. What are the highs of being a landscape architect?
I think it's when there's real ownership, that people own the project that you're doing, and that your client can describe, or the community can describe exactly what they like about the project and are using it and how you thought it was going to be used. That's an important aspect of it. So and that's quite an interesting one, because obviously timescales is another factor. Some of the projects I will not see mature in my lifetime. If I plant an oak tree in a planting plan, and I specify it, it's not going to be mature for at least 100 years. So it's outside of my lifetime.
Wow. Do you have an example though where you have seen the whole process of that? You've been there in the design stages of a particular project, and then you've then heard the community talk back about how they use it, and it's kind of come to fruition, the vision that you had for that area, that space.
I mean, the one that comes to mind at the moment is probably, it's a little one that's just down the road from me, and it's a group of parents got together. And there was a road to be closed, but one of the parents very savagely applied for a grant for a public art project, because public art can be quite a good catalyst for change. Not always, but it can be. It was a little project. It was a little bit contentious, so shall we say. It's quite tricky when you have quite divided opinions in communities. And when it comes to streets and cars, you might have seen in the press, streets and cars, it's massive divisions at the moment. It'd be interesting to see what happens over the next 10 to 20 years, whether those divisions are still there or whether it just moves on. But that was a big, sort of quite divisive with the community. But the problem was where the school, there was a school right on the road where the road was closed. There was kids that were being knocked over by cars. There was a lot of long-term issues. So, and actually streets around schools, etc., are a really major problem in terms of car use and parking and etc. and safety. So we wanted to make this area not just a walk-through place. We actually wanted it where some people are going to sit and maybe play, etc. So it's called Frogmarsh, and it's in Easton in Bristol, and it's been really successful in the fact that it's actually they did a before and an after survey. Actually, the before was there was a sort of skepticism about 50-50 division, and now it's more like 70-30 about the success. So that makes you realize how, you know, that transition challenge and change perceptions, particularly for parents. And during COVID, obviously a lot of playgrounds got closed, but this didn't, and there was a lot of kids playing there during that time, so it became a very valid small park rather than a street. So,
wow, that is sounds really successful as a project. Did you say a parent had applied for that? I mean, that's incredible to involve the community and the users of that space in that place. What role do you think communities should have in placemaking and having some ownership over the way that the places they're spending time are designed?
I think at the moment the issue we have in the UK, and this is not, actually it's not true, it's not just in the UK, because my other hat that I wear is I'm one of the directors of the Association of Collaborative Design, which is a community interest company, which is all about the process of co-design and collaborative design, not just with communities, but with other professionals and stakeholders and clients, etc. Now, the thing is, at the moment, is that the way we're taught at university, the way we're taught at school, is we're not really provided with the best skill set when it comes to actually working with people, and I mean with rather than for, and that is the big difference. So if you're working with communities, you need a different sort of skill set, a different sort of experience than you are working for. And I think that communities have a massive role to play, because the ownership side's really, really important. But we just have to remember a few factors. Who you're going to consult, because if you engage and consult, there are differences. But if you are engaging with a set group, so a fixed group, that could be quite limited. And then the issue that you sometimes have is everyone's like, well, not everyone has engaged in this. You have to think of limitations of areas, and you have to be careful about the different techniques and skills and requirements that are set for different types of neighbourhoods and areas. So for example, if you have lower income areas, they are less likely to have access to Wi-Fi. So having an internet-based engagement process and designing that process and how you're going to facilitate that process becomes very different than one that maybe has got availability to that. You've got to think about also about if you have areas where you have, let's say there's a high percentage of younger population of people, again, you're going to have to go for a different approach. You're going to have to go to them more than rather than them come to you. That's my experience, because it means going to where they hang out. Going to the cinema, going to the places where they hang out, because and being able to have that process there, because if it doesn't really work the other way around. Different processes and different techniques are needed, and you need a creativity with it. You need to have the personal skills to do it, and you also, as a designer, may not be the right person to do it either, and it will fluctuate from context to area. But the thing is that your role as a designer is you've got to get all of that information and get it to work, because there are some things that you are a fix. There's no way, whatever anyone says, there's no way you can negotiate anything else or be flexible with. There's some things which are like, I'm afraid that's what has to be done. But there's some things that are flexible.
Do you feel, though, that in that placemaking and designing spaces process, communities should always be engaged in that process?
I would say more and more, the more experience I get, the process is more important than the design. And so the designing of that process is more important, because the governance, the way something's going to be done, how you're going to do it, who you're going to consult, when you're going to consult, how long is it going to be. There's some projects I've been on where it was 25 years.
Wow.
So can you imagine the generational change during that time?
Yeah.
So if you might consult someone one day, but 10 years later, they don't live there anymore. And this is the flex and flow that you have to consider. Like, in 30 years, you can have a complete change of population. So that's why, as much as community engagement is really core and crucial, you also have to have an element of consistency within it as well. There are some things which are core things that people need, regardless. Like, for example, access to nature is a core thing, and there's some things which are fundamental rights, like, for example, the right to light. And there should be, I personally think, a fundamental right to be able to access nature, a fundamental right to feel safe on the road, whether you're a cyclist, whether you're a pedestrian, whatever your demographics are, whatever your gender is. I think that you have to, as much as there's flexibility within communities in terms of culturally, etc., and that's where the detail is important, but there are bits which are a general sort of, there needs to be, and that's what it is indicating about being fixed and what's flexible. And the detail aspects, the crucial bit that creates the character, that makes the change, that makes the identity.
I just want to ask, and maybe it's a bit of a hard question, I don't know, but what is co-design?
Essentially, it's designing with people.
Okay,
that's really what it is, and that's all the way through the process. So I'm a landscape architect, and I have a professional body which is called the Landscape Institute. And the Landscape Institute, I have to be chartered. I'm actually a fellow, which is the next one up. But to be chartered, you have to have gone through some, you can either go through an apprenticeship route or you can go through a university route. And the reason I'll talk about co-design is you'll get to in a sec. So the apprenticeship route and the university route, you end up becoming chartered and a professional body. Another professional body example is REBA, which is the Royal Institute of British Architects. And what they've produced are work stages. And that is that every project, as a professional, you have to go through a series of work stages, which is called the REBA plan of work. And most projects follow it. So for that to work, what's missing from it at the moment is how that would work from a community engagement and co-design element. It's very much working on a more, I call, hierarchy, designing for, and a hierarchical position of you as a designer, and you control everything. But what's missing is the community engagement bit for the collaborative design element of working with or partnershiping. I mean, it's quite interesting, the terminologies. Quite a lot of females and women prefer collaborative, while more male side men are more partnerships.
Right, interesting.
I do find it funny, the terminology difference that appeals to people. So that's what I found. But at the moment, the ACD, Association of Collaborative Design, that we're working with REBA at the moment to do a REBA work stages community engagement process.
Oh, fantastic.
We're working with Sustrans, Homes England, Design Council, and a number of other organisations and individuals.
That's great. So things are changing a little bit there, hopefully, possibly.
It might take a while. But it's been flagged in planning legislation, it's been flagged in research that really it has a number of names. Collaborative design, participatory design process is urgently needed in terms of planning. And there is another reason for it. It's not just because you're working with people, it's to do with ownership. It's also to do with the fact that from a planning perspective, if you're trying to get a development through plan, it's really important to win neighbourhoods about what you're doing. It makes the process much easier, and it means that you have a stewardship potential after that and the people, if it's residential for example, move into the area, there is an already existing connection.
You've mentioned lots around challenges and issues, and particularly in the UK as well, around placemaking, and how some of your work involves a lot of convincing. What, in your opinion, are the biggest challenges in placemaking?
I think the big challenge we have is health and biodiversity. I'm not going to call it biodiversity, that's a technical term, specifics. I think it's more to do with wildlife and nature, in terms of the fact that we have an increasing global populations moving into cities, living in cities. How do you, and I mean the pandemic's a key component of this, how do you maintain a healthy population, not just of people but for nature as well, because both are in surprise parallel crisis. There's a really interesting quote of basically how health has been basically poor health. It's been planned, it's been managed and subsidized that we are in poor health. And you can say exactly the same for nature. So there are things changing, like for example, with climate change, for example, one of the big things we have big challenges in cities is urban heat island effect and heat vulnerability, particularly within city centre areas and areas of very high urban densities. And obviously things like, surprise, nature and greenery and being able to design buildings that are, going to cope with that, but also with a landscape that works with that and that they work together. It's crucial.
Can you explain, the urban heat
island effect?
Simply
put, basically, that there's a big temperature difference between in the city centres and outside, because essentially things like more buildings, more hard surfaces create increased heat temperatures. That's a really simple way of putting it. And in more rural locations and greener spaces, there's normally temperature drop. And trees are a really good example of that. There was a research done in Australia where there's been obviously a lot of wildfires and mass increase of heat. And the temperature difference between underneath the tree canopy and outside of the tree canopy can be up to 15 degrees. So it makes you realize, and if the tree has a soft landscape underneath it, i.e. grass is not so great actually, more other types of planting than grass, because grass is actually not brilliant, that also increases that temperature difference.
Wow. So is it about kind of, why is that a problem? Is it a problem?
So if you think about it, and I'll give you a good example. In India at the moment, the current surface temperature is 60 degrees. Now our blood is 37. So if you think of the impact that has on your health, you can see your body will start to break down. If you think about it, how it affects just us, then it's going to affect nature as well. And that's when you have major issues like wildfires on the extreme end, or you have complete exhaustion. And I think it was Miami, or maybe it was Los Angeles, where they declared a state of an emergency because of the heat issues were so massive. So there's a massive economic issue with it, there's a massive health issue with it, and that's why you can't ignore economics with these sort of situations. People think they're separated, they're not, they're wholly inclusive of both, relying on each other.
So how does designing places, or how can that respond to this issue then, this massive challenge?
Well, if you do it in a really simplistic way, first of all, is you remove the amount of hard landscape, i.e. like hard surfaces, paving stuff. That's the first thing you've got to think about.
Okay.
because the less there are of that, the better. And then that has added effects, and that's where you call green infrastructure, where basically it's not just about a singular benefit, it's about multiple benefits. So things like sustainable urban drainage, which is to do with slowing down the rates of flow of water and being able to control the microclimate on a micro scale, to do with soil health. Soil's really, really crucial. So you have these multiple benefits for health and nature and water all at the same time. So one of the another hat I wear is I'm a building of nature assessor, which is specifically about assessing projects around green infrastructure. And their main embodiment is about multifunctional networks. Land is such a commodity, we need it to really function in lots of different ways for the maximum benefit.
Yes, and have kind of maybe multiple uses, not multiple uses, but I'm guessing, yeah,
it can do. But also being aware that from an ecological standpoint, you need also areas which are just for ecology.
When you say green infrastructure, obviously there's loads of different elements there that need to be taken into consideration. Is that something that you can see
all the time? You look out outside your window.
Yeah. So when is it possible to go to a place and be like, I can see there's
links,
brilliant green infrastructure going on in this area?
Yeah, I mean, you have to do it at a scale, because the big issue at the moment is that you have green infrastructure is about linking that as a network, so it all joins together.
Right.
And just things like, I'll give you an example. I'm not an ecologist, but I do know working with ecologists, bats are a classic example, where if you have more than a 2 meter gap in a hedgerow, the bat will change its route. So you've got to think about stepping stones through cities for nature. Everything's become fractured, just like communities, human ones. It's the same with nature becoming fractured, whereby there's very isolation. And so you have another issue in terms of you need that diversity for things to thrive. And it's exactly the same with humans. You don't have diversity, it just won't thrive.
Yeah.
And so the sort of population migration between these places needs to be done in a way so that nature can thrive, and colonies of species can thrive as well, of birds and insects specifically, because they are the main aspect here of the sort of, should we say, ecosystem pyramid.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, the green infrastructure is really what the infrastructure, and why they call it infrastructure is that when you talk about infrastructure, you think roads, but that's exactly the same, but for species. For including humans and active travel and low carbon travel, but also through wildlife, but also through flood prevention and water quality, etc. It all has to sort of work together. It's quite a complex system.
And there has been some movement, I think, to people understanding that slightly more when we talk about rewilding. The pandemic itself brought it into people's minds a lot more, just the whole experience of where's my nearest green space that I can go out and enjoy. It certainly made me a lot more aware of nature, which I think it did for lots of people.
Yeah, I mean, it's been really interesting because at a time during the pandemic, I mean, you're thinking back to it now, you're like, how do we do this? But in terms of people discovering small green spaces they would never have used before, or walking on streets they never would have.
Exactly.
Or being able to find enjoyment or quiet. I mean, another hat I wear is about a citizen science project, which is all about noise pollution. It's the Hush City project in Berlin. Anyone can do it. In fact, any school kids, anyone can really get involved in it. And that is about citizen science approach of evaluating quietness of spaces. So, I mean, the thing about, I'm going to slight bugbear, so I hate the term rewild. So I'll tell you why. It's a bit, people don't realise, but in the UK, there is nothing wild. There never has, I say never has been. There has been, but thousands of years ago. But in terms of farming, all of that thing and management, etc., there was no wilderness, as in wild wilderness, in the UK at all. That's all gone. And the issue I have with the term rewilding is it's basically saying that humans create that wildness when actually it's the other way around. It's when humans don't interfere. Maybe in 1,000 years or so. So that's why sort of like bringing nature back and wildlife and creating more increased biodiversity, definitely. And there's a thing called biodiversity net gain that's in planning at the moment. You have to achieve 10% of that biodiversity, and it's going to become mandatory next year. So that's another challenge that we have of how do you incorporate that into quite urban sites. So, but it's needed.
Yeah, so I have a question then around, say, kind of access. So we're talking there a little bit about access to green spaces, but also ensuring that everyone can access that, you know, and it may be really simplistic, but thinking about removing hard surfaces, how do you then ensure it's still accessible for, I'm thinking of wheelchair users, or, you know, what other,
you have to build it all in.
Round would that be, you know, how can you ensure it's still an inclusive space that everyone can make use of?
So that's your challenge, and that's the challenge of today, because at the moment we're very fixated, particularly in the UK, on cars and vehicles. So we have to start questioning about why they dominate streets and spaces so much, particularly within cities, because it's those spaces, it's not the pavements we need to, I mean, yes, to an extent, but actually it's the actual carriageway, it's the roads. That's the thing that needs to be reviewed and looked at, not just impinging on where people walk or cycle at the moment, but changing that whole process. I mean, there's things like people talk about sort of 15-minute neighborhoods and changing cities to be more cycle friendly or even entirely car free like they have in Oslo. There's no car, actually it's quite interesting, it's not car free, it's parking free, because when they told everyone it was going to be car free, everyone freaked out. But when they said it was going to be parking, no parking at all through the whole of central Oslo, you can drive through but you can't park. Massive drop in people driving because there's nowhere to park. So I mean that works to an extent, but in the UK, we have the additional challenge of that we have very low density housing. So you have a different transport challenge there, because for even a small country, the cities are quite densely populated right in the centre, but then it just becomes more of a suburban sprawl. And that makes a different sort of challenge. So,
and that kind of talk around the 15-minute city, it's interesting you say that, because having grown up in a city, I've been privileged to have quite a lot of things very easily accessible for me within walking distance. But this person had grown up in like a small village, and their whole experience of that space was, well, they were quite reliant on the car
completely
to access certain amenities. So it's complex, isn't it? It's very complex.
So I think what happens is a lot of people focus on city centres, and they also focus on a lot of European examples. But the thing is a lot of European cities, northern European cities in particular, have got much higher density city centre residential areas. So it's very common to see, you know, people living in apartments 6 to 8 stories high. In the UK, that's not very much. I'm here in Bristol, and where I live, it's 2-story Victorian housing, which really is inadequate, to be honest. And so there is this challenge of how do you do that, particularly with communities who have lived and are established. So when it comes to sort of transport change, etc., we're going to have to be a little bit more imaginative than just okay, everybody can cycle everywhere. Maybe everyone has to have electric bikes, maybe shared mobility schemes, and a different diversity of schemes should happen. Maybe we should start reopening the small suburban railway lines more, you know, that were removed in the 60s. I think those are the sort of challenges that then open up more possibilities of what happens in terms of green infrastructure, because the big challenge we have is, do you want a car parking space or do you want a tree?
It's a behaviour change as well, I suppose.
Behaviour change, but it's also, I mean, what I find interesting with the work from home at the moment, which still happens now as a lot of people do hybrid, is that I think what will happen is that you'll start getting little hubs appearing of more like co-working spaces, small office spaces, because a lot of people haven't got the space in the house, or they just want to get out of the house, but they don't want to commute into the city centre. And you can see that with the increased fuel prices. People can't afford to commute. So I think that's going to change, and quite rapidly, because otherwise there'll be a paralysis. And so I'll give you an example. Is in Bristol, there's 57 high streets.
Right.
That's just in Bristol. Bristol's not even, I think it's maybe just 500,000 at a push population.
Yeah, wow.
So places like Manchester and Birmingham, you can imagine how many high streets there are. It gives you an idea of possibility. So if councils and developers just focus on the city centre, which is a very male-centric, to be honest, then that's just not the future. I don't think. I think you can't have everything just bottlenecking to one central point.
No.
That's where you need to start focusing on how the design of high streets, how the design of small spaces that are on the peripheral edge bring those people together. And that's where things like schools are really important, because if you think about the number of movements of people, children and parents and guardians taking their kids to school, then you're talking about thousands of people every day moving in that circle. How do you do that in a more sustainable fashion? I think what COVID has made people realise is the value of nature and their health. I think that's increased things. But there's flip sides of basically inequalities. You know, some people are like, oh, I just step outside my door and it's a really leafy place. I can tell you right now, there's a lot of people who do not have that.
Absolutely.
Do not have that privilege and really struggled to be able to access, because either they don't have the transportation to get there, it's too difficult, it's unsafe. There's all these different aspects, and that's the inequality aspect. I think is getting worse personally than better, and that's where the community engagement side is a problem, because if you go and say we would like people to come to a community engagement thing, it's the people who have time that will come.
Absolutely.
People who have time are normally wealthier, so you need to spend more time and have back to my previous point of being a bit imaginative and bringing people from diverse backgrounds, different ethnicities, to come in to be part of the profession, part of the community, to be part of that process, to give them agency to do this.
Does it land with placemakers or people that are designing those spaces do they have a responsibility to address that social inequality, that inequality?
Responsibility of design, I think, still lands on the designer. And there's a legal reason for that. I'm afraid, boringly, in most design aspects in the UK, come down to law and liability and insurance. It sounds really dull. It does. And you can, but there are ways around it, and there are the most exciting projects are ones normally where there's no designers involved.
Okay.
So, like, for example, the incredible edible project in Todmorden, where they basically took over green spaces in Todmorden and planted them with fruit and veg. The big issue is that local authorities can't afford to manage or maintain the parks and gardens they have as well. So I think things are going to change from a management perspective, but you can't rely on volunteers to do it either. I think it's not a fair process. And to be honest, back to who's got time. And again, what are the areas that will thrive under voluntary? Again, it's not going to be the lower income areas.
No.
So that's where I'm just sort of like, that's great as an innovation for more wealthier people who have the time, but not for low incomes. And so that's why you have an equity of process. You have an equity of different models applied for management and stewardship, etc., and different funds. Some people need more support than others. That's life. That's where it is.
You've mentioned before about everyone having a fundamental right to access nature and to feel safe in the places that they spend time. You also mentioned about how city centres are very male-centric. And I just wondered if we could chat a little bit about that, and particularly because this has also come up along I mean, so much has happened in this pandemic experience, but certainly women's safety has come up. And I wonder if you could explain a bit what you mean by city centres being male centric.
Who really raised it to my attention was a friend of mine, Zoe Banks-Gross, who is actually, she's the head of partnerships at South of England at Sustrans, but very much in terms of also publications like Invisible Women. And the main thing is, if you think about it traditionally, I'm not very good on history, but probably until the 80s, to be really truthful, maybe even later, it was the men going to work and the women at home. And so the main routes that were designed were to a centralized workplace. So all the transportation, the road networks, everything were on that specific route. I mean, obviously, historically, it was to do with battles and all roads lead to Rome. But there's just all of that link. But the reality is that male-centric route means that it doesn't take in consideration what a lot of carers and women do, which I think it's 85% of carers are women, and their routes are much more complex. So, for example, if they're going to school, they might want to stop on shops, or they need to do X and Y on that route. They have to do multiple things during that process, which are not really catered for in the current city designs. The other issue we have is the majority of designers who are making those decisions, and clients and local authorities who are heading up, are male. So, and I very much believe in the lived experience. So, for example, I understand that, that there are men and males who do understand it, but when it actually comes to design and thinking, it can be quite different. And there are women as well, because you've been trained into a specific way of designing and thinking things as well, or that's just the way it's done, when actually that's not the case. And I'll give you an example. I was on a project and I do design review panels, so I would critique other designs and developments that come through, particularly, it's now nationally, I do it nationally as well now. And there, people forget that, for example, women in general, after 8 o'clock, are very unlikely to be out on the street, walking down a street alone if it was poorly lit.
Yep.
While men tend to not even think about it.
Yeah.
Not even a second thought, it's just done. And so I was sitting in this thing, and they had the street had this very old historic wall, which was about, I don't know, maybe 4 meters high on one side. And then on the other side, it was 2 meters high. So it was like a tunnel. And I was just like, as a woman, I would never walk down that street on my own at night. No way.
No.
But they hadn't even thought about that. And I was like, you have an opportunity to actually improve this. There is ways of designing it so it is feel safer. But they hadn't even considered it. Why? Because it was an all-male design team.
Yeah. Which is why we need to diversify those people and those professionals working in those roles, don't we? To ensure that those things are considered.
It's diversifying, but also educating and making people
that too,
aware.
yes.
Because, I mean, as I say, some women designers, etc., you're educated in a specific way. You may not even consider that from your own perspective as well. So it's a mixture of getting people on, but it's also being aware of different ways things can be used and perceived. So.
Yeah. And do you feel that will happen, that is happening? Is the sector becoming more representative of all the different people in society, not just women, but,
honestly?
Yeah.
No.
Right.
I mean, maybe it will. My profession, landscape architect, the Landscape Institute did a survey, and they're doing a survey at the moment as well. Their previous survey was that there was hardly anyone from Black or other ethnicities or people of colour in the profession, period. And it's a predominantly white profession, and those in senior roles were male and white, and normally middle-aged, like a lot of the UK.
Yeah, a lot, yeah.
Whether that's actually changed or not, I'm not sure. I couldn't say for certain because there's an evidence pointing one way or another, but I do know that they've got a survey out at the moment. It'd be interesting to see what the outcome is from that, because that would be 5 years later. So it'd be interesting if anything's changed. There are things coming along like the Shape My City programme in Bristol with Design West. That's really encouraging in terms of getting people from sort of different backgrounds, diverse groups, etc., involved or even aware that a profession like landscape architecture exists, which previously it didn't. A lot of people are just not aware of it. I think that also, when I looked at jobs in the past, 20 years ago when I started, a lot of landscape offices were based outside of cities, and now there's more and more based in cities. Now that's quite different. So again, that's going to appeal basic to different people, etc. as well. But I think it's got a long way to go, if I'm honest.
In your opinion, what should we be doing to encourage diverse representation? What could be happening? What should we be doing to push for it?
To answer that, I will try my best. I can do it only from my own standpoint. So what can we do? Well, first of all, it's encouraging people that there is a profession out there and they can be part of it, and they are welcome to be part of it, very much so. And then that also, on the other side of it, is about ownership. Public space is public, it's for everyone.
Yeah.
Not everyone is aware of that. And they also may not be aware that they can be part of that process of changing it.
Yeah.
I think the other issue you have is being aware of the processes behind all of it, and sort of just people need more support and communicating about how that's going to work. I think also empowering and lifting individuals who are doing great work, who are from those diverse backgrounds when you're at a position of power.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, a lot of people talk about allyship and being able to basically lift that. But it's, my own personal experience is that you get a very mixed outcome. There are some organisations who just don't want to change. And I'm like, if you don't want to change, well, maybe we do something else that doesn't include you.
Yeah.
And that will become really successful, and then you'll be really regretful.
Yes. Yeah.
But I think it's lifting what is there, is amplifying other voices.
And that links back to that kind of community work as well, doesn't it? The community engagement as well, and ensuring those voices are heard.
Yeah, I mean, people call it hard to reach. I hate that term. I just think it's just a bit lazy. And just also just not really thinking of other things that are other ways of doing something.
Yeah,
it
fair
doesn't
enough.
have to be the same.
Yeah.
I think also you have to be aware that you might get backlash. You might get you might get anger. But you just have to. That's unfortunately, that's where you have to learn the sort of art of the sort of diplomacy.
Yeah, definitely. And then kind of championing those in those positions to advocate for change. Do you feel a sense of responsibility? I mentioned in my intro about you being one of the leading women in design, and do you feel a responsibility there in that being acknowledged as that, or is that motivating for you?
It can be a bit daunting.
Yeah.
I mean, there's always going to be someone who's better than you. There's always going to be someone who's like, of course. But I do tend to try and mentor, encourage people. But I myself have, I run 2 companies and I have quite limited time. So that's why I tend to get involved in things that are much more wider than just individuals. It's more on a bigger side of it. So, for example, the Hush City Citizen Science Programme is about noise pollution and the impact of it, which is because noise pollution is the second biggest environmental health problem in Western Europe. People focus a lot on air pollution, which I totally get, but it's the noise pollution is also a big factor. But that's a big change. And the group that I have for Bristol, we do sound walks with sound. It's very diverse backgrounds. So this part of me is just like, there's only so much one person can do.
Absolutely.
At the time, I try and do as much as I can. But I think there's always better. There's always different ways of doing things, and I try and be fairly open to what that might be.
You referenced so many different projects in our conversation as well, that I would love to kind of make a note of those so people can go off and read more about them. Before we kind of finish off the conversation today, is there a project that you are most proud of, or not really?
I mean, there's lots of different parts of design projects. I mean, the issue I have is that because I don't do one type of thing, like I do some public realm street design work. I like, for example, the competition Home of 2030 about future living. That was really fun, and we worked in a really amazing collaborative way as a team. But it's a fantasy project that hopefully is going to come to life soon. But who knows? I did enjoy doing that. That was fun. I think also it made people aware of, I thought we were joint winners, and the other further one was LTA Landscape. And what I find interesting was they were both heavily landscape driven projects that won. And I think that's quite interesting. It was very nice of them to say that it was one of the things that won was our involvement in it. So that's great. But yeah, I think the projects that, as I said before, have ownership, like the Frogmarsh one really makes me happy every day, mainly because I see it, it's a local influence, but it also, we've had such great feedback from it. I think the Shapwick one, the Avalon Marshes project, I love that one because it's every time I go back there, it looks different, something else is growing, so I see that development. But I think for me, just setting up the Association of Collaborative Design, I find it mind-blowing that we started something 2 years ago in the start of a pandemic. And it's grown into this international organisation now where we're doing stuff with UN Habitat and the World Urban Campaign. I mean, that's just, and it just have the most amazing team of volunteers. We're all doing voluntary. So that was just mind-blowing in itself.
You're such an inspirational person, Sarah. Listening here, you've mentioned so many things in my head. Is like, wow, it's going to be a great takeaway to mull over, think about, read up about, kind of set my mind off spiraling. Hopefully it has for everyone else listening. So to kind of close our conversation, I want to just ask, what are you most excited or hopeful about for the future?
So yeah, one of the things I think it's going to be quite interesting is when things like biodiversity net gain and public health become much more of a paramount of value to people and clients, that it becomes sort of a why. It goes, well, when do we deliver it? And how do we deliver it? Rather than why do we deliver this? That I am really hopeful for, and I think is happening, because there's a lot of unusual clients that I work for. Actually, it came out last week, Green Infrastructure Action Plan for a business improvement district. It means that what you're trying to do is you're consolidating something that's going to have a public and private benefit, but it's actually public and private finance, but with public benefit. Now, they're businesses, like quite big businesses, and they're telling me, we want something that's biodiverse, we want climate resilience, we want active travel, we want low carbon, we want all of these things in our city. I think that's really, really big change, because it means that investors are saying, if you're not doing something that is going to improve the city from a health, well-being and nature, we're not going to invest. And that is a big shift. I do think that, you've got younger generation coming up who are much more aware. When there was a change in national curriculum while I was at school that was much more fed into, in the late 90s about climate change and global warming, etc. And I think that's filtering through now, and people are much more aware of it. The other thing that I find fascinating is that I was invited as being part of a steering group, which is international, with 5 different countries. And it's called Urban Care, and it's about the health and well-being of cities, but actually creating modules for universities to incorporate in nearly all university projects and degrees.
Wow. So that's going
a bit
down
mind-blowing.
That's the educating bit though, isn't it?
And it's really, really important. I mean, I know there's a GCSE that's coming out. I think there's a natural history GCSE. That would be interesting to see how that forms part of it. But this is also for just any degree. It's such a fundamental fact, and it cross-sections all sorts of different people. Public realm affects someone who does the cleaning, someone who cleans the streets, someone who works in finance, someone who does banking, to plumbers, everybody.
And very finally, if you could speak to 17-year-old Sarah, is there any bit of advice you would give her, knowing what you know now?
Okay, maybe the teachers may not want to hear this. They can switch the video off now. It's fine. I did really badly in GCSEs, really badly in A-levels. I hated academics. I was fine at university, but kind of was a bit bored. For me, the way that education is in the UK was totally just total switch off. But it's also to be aware that working life and beyond that is totally different. And for me, was like the thing that made me thrive. It wasn't school, it wasn't education. And as much as we have to go through the process of it, it wasn't the thing that made me think, yeah, that's what it's going to make me do better in life as a job or a degree. In fact, my parents were in a completely like, she doesn't want to do a degree. Any sort of last minute decides to do it because I've got nothing else to do. It's also because it was free. My year and 2 years above that, it was free. Otherwise you'd have to pay. So it was like, quick, get on it.
That's really interesting. So perhaps it was more around the way you were being educated. Do you think if it had been more obviously applicable to real life?
Yeah, I should have done an apprenticeship. The moment I started working, it was like, fine. For me, just I wasn't the best student at school.
So your advice would be, you'd say to 17-year-old Sarah, just get through it, work's going to be great.
Yeah, it's fine, don't worry about it. I mean, obviously, there are some people in my profession who did all their straight A's and everything else. That doesn't mean they're any better as a landscape architect.
No, definitely not.
Everything in terms of the skills you learn at university and the school, that's what I was saying right at the beginning, are just not fit for really the skills that are needed now.
Can those skills come from work experience, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, a friend of mine called it tacit learning, whereby there is only so much that you can read and watch and listen. There's some things you're just going to have to do. And you have to just try out, because that is where you really cement learning. I think it comes from arts and crafts movement. I'm not sure, but I think it does, whereby there was a real concern about industrialization and about how the fact that these craftsmen, it isn't something, that learning that you learn from construction, of which there is like really big issue of lack of craftsmen and construction and horticulture, massive. No one wants a job, you've got a job. But this idea that you can't, there are a lot of things you're just going to have to do and fail and try again and fail and try again. Not everything I've done worked amazingly. That's, if anyone says it has, they're talking rubbish. You just have to keep trying at these things, and actually it's the determination and endurance of doing that and being able to like just, it's going to fail, something's going to fail, whatever you do in life, something will fail, but it's whether you can like just make it improve upon it.
Sarah, thank you so much for your time today, and for the really inspiring and interesting and really insightful things that you've shared today, and perspective on the built environment and placemaking and shaping.
That's all right. No, thank you.